Welcome to the lecture on interviewing skills, specifically on the advanced influencing skills. For this particular lecture, we're going to essentially go through the remainder of the textbook. And in this lecture, we will cover chapters. I'm pulling my textbook here to make sure that I give you the accurate information. We're going to go very briefly through chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12, and I will touch really, really briefly on 13 and 14. So let's fly through the last part of the book. This is the micro skills pyramid, which takes the skills of helping, essentially, of interviewing, and breaks them down into the micro skills. We've been covering them throughout the semester, and we've been on what I call the lower part of the pyramid, the blue, well, the pink through the blue stages. And in this lecture, we're taking and using those as a base, assuming that you understand and you're beginning to master those lower level skills, or at least you're gaining a good understanding and ability to use them. Making that assumption, we're now going to use those to use the higher level skills, which are skills that influence the client's actions and decisions. So you can see over here on the left side of the pyramid, the basic listening sequence, and then you can see the influencing client's actions and decision skills. So we'll start with chapter 9. In chapter 9, we're going to talk about focusing. And really, to make this easy, all we're talking about is the client's talking, client sharing their story, you're engaging in the basic listening sequence, and you're now going to ask them to talk about this aspect of the story, this part of their story, this part of their story. So in some ways, that's like guiding or leading, but focusing is more broadly not as simplistic as I just explained. Instead, it's saying, here's the whole story. They've already said it or they're talking about it. Now, let's step back out of the story and look at the same story from a different perspective. So, you've probably, in some kind of an English literature class, you've talked about the first person perspective, the third person perspective. This is very similar to that. So this is directing or leading the client with questions or some other format to consider one or more aspects of their story or topic from like a different perspective than it currently is. And this allows them to elaborate that story from multiple perspectives. You'll notice throughout these slides, I have different page numbers that you might prefer to. And if you're using this edition of the book that you could have checked out from the library, the ninth edition, the page numbers the page numbers will apply. If you're not using the ninth edition, you'll want to get you'll just have to look in the chapter and you'll find relevant pages. So the way that you would use this skill is that as you're listening and you're getting an understanding of where the client is, like what perspective they're focusing on as they elaborate or discuss their story or their issue that they're discussing with you. Then you'll use a paraphrase to make sure that you're understanding what they're talking about. And then you use some type of an open question to invite them to explore their story from a different perspective than what they have been doing it. So there's a lot of different ways that there are a lot of different reasons that you might ask them to do this. It can help, like if they're kind of stuck in the confusion of saying the same thing again, it can bring them outside of that and ask them, like, give them some more clarity, or just bring them out of the same repetitious thing they've been saying again and again. Bring them out and give them a broader perspective as opposed to a narrow perspective. And therefore, it can bring clarity. Um, this is not going to give them clarity or understanding if this is the same thing they've been doing and talking about again and again. So one of the ways that I've seen this to be helpful from is when people are really, really mad and they and they're like, oh, well, maybe I could try to understand this from someone else's perspective. Another thing that it can help for is if they're seeing their story, or help with, is that if they're seeing their issue story, whatever they're discussing from one perspective, but you're like, I'm not seeing it the same way, is that you can invite them to uh, to like consider their story from your perspective, how you might see it, like use the imagination. So, is with all of these, what I consider the upper level skills of the pyramid, right? So, if we look at the pyramid, like moving up the pyramid, these upper level skills, you're going to see again and again. I'm going to say you want to avoid these before you know that you've built in the how to, in the blue section here, where it says, you're doing the 5 stage interview thing and you've built an empathetic relationship and you've established story and strength so that you have a sense of who they are and you've begun to build rapport. You don't want to use the influencing skills until you know that you have some kind of rapport and trust in the relationship. So if you're unsure of where they're going, you don't want to then like take them a different, like say, hey, but look at your story from a different perspective if you're not even sure of where they are going in their current perspective. And you definitely don't want to focus them because you're interested or you're like, ooh, that's interesting. Let me see what a different perspective might be on your story. So you're not trying to use this for your own curiosity or point of interest. You would want to have an intentional, um, a reason to do this for the client. So that's focusing. If you're interested more in the skill, feel free to look into the chapter. There's a whole dialogue that I think is really helpful. There's a set of questions and a breakdown of different ways that you could like kind of different lenses or different perspectives that you can use to focus the story. Empathetic confrontation might be one of the most important skills for growth. So this is a way that you can supportively challenge the client to address those discrepancies that you observed in your use of the observation skill. Um, so I think it's important here that you're not like saying like, why the heck are you have this inconsistency or this discrepancy? Instead, what you're doing is that you're trying to go with the client and you're trying to go into that area of discrepancy, invite them to go into that space because that is the area for growth. So instead of, and you may not have this problem, but in my experience, some students have they can get irritated with discrepancies in when they hear people's stories. I don't know if they're irritated because they don't understand the story because it has a discrepancy, or I'm not sure what the irritation is always about for people. But I'm trying to reframe those discrepancies and that irritation as not a point to be irritated about, but a part of the human experience and the area that we're actually very curious about as helpers, in the area that we want to pursue and understand better, because that area of discrepancy is the area for growth. So I'll give an example. Someone says, I really want to lose weight. It's very important to me. I want to exercise more. The weather is getting better. Yesterday, I put my tennis shoes on and then I just sat in front of the television. Now I'm really mad at myself and I can't believe I didn't get out and take a walk. Um, and I've been doing this, I got so motivated. It's the first time I actually even got as far as putting my shoes on, etc. Like this is an area of discrepancy. So instead of getting annoyed at someone, you would want to hopefully help them produce growth and change. And the idea, right, is that they would produce new thoughts, feelings, behaviors, right? New ideas would come out of the ability to go into this area of discrepancy. Your job is to kind of highlight the discrepancy, to sit empathetically with that discrepancy. And there's a couple ways to do that. So the first way to do it, I'm going to how to, is an implicit way to do it. Is there's various ways within using the basic listening sequence that you can like just sit with, point out, be comfortable with the discrepancy. I hear that yesterday you were really frustrated with yourself for putting your tennis shoes on, but not going out and taking a walk, even though it was a beautiful day. So that's an example of like a reflection of feeling. That's one way that you could do it. That's implicit. There's a bunch of other ways, right? That in the course of this person's whole story, I just gave you like a little example here, but I'm sure that if you were listening to them, you'd hear like this whole story that they've been telling you. You can imagine it, right? So with the same person, you could go more explicitly into it with an empathetic confrontation. And a more explicit way would be that you actually state the discrepancy. And the way that you do this is you're not like, I don't know what the heck is wrong with you either. Why didn't you get yourself up off that couch? You keep telling me about how you want to lose weight. And yesterday was a beautiful day and you were somewhat motivated. Instead of like running with your motivation, you just sat down on the couch and you weren't even comfortable on the couch. You had your tennis shoes on. Like, what was that about? Right. So that's not really the way we're talking about doing this. I can't imagine any of you doing it that way anyways, but instead of doing it that way, what you're going to do is you're going to do a gentle paraphrase or reflection of feelings, and you're going to point out that discrepancy. So, um, I don't know if I have this clearly here, but here's the way that you're going to do it. So on the one hand, you've been telling me how much you want to lose weight, and one of the ways that you'd like to do that is to get you, and you've talked about numerous ways you'd like to do that through diet, through exercise, through like eating more healthy, eating less. And yesterday you had an example of a time when you actually felt motivated to do it. You put your tennis shoes on, but even though you want to lose weight and you're looking for motivation, even though all that's going on, you actually just sat on the couch and didn't walk. Could we talk a little bit about what that's about? So you're like literally, I do it with my hands because that's my style, but literally you're showing this point of discrepancy. You've got all of this you've told me, but yesterday you didn't do it. So you're, to me, this is the way I visualize it in my head. This is the point right here. Yesterday was the crux point of where this event happened. And so that's a way that you explicitly point out the discrepancy. Because it could happen in the middle of an interview when someone says, like, oh, I really want to talk about all the, the fighting that's been going on in my house with my significant other. And they start then talking about school. And so for 3 or 4 minutes, you hear them talking about school, even though they started the interview by saying that they wanted to talk about the fight that they had with their significant other. So you can pause them with a paraphrase, with a summary. So I heard you talk about all these things in relation to your significant other. And at the beginning today, you talked about wanting to talk about, or yeah, at the beginning, I heard you wanting to talk about your significant other, but then we've talked about school for the last 3 or 4 minutes. I know sometimes it's been hard for you to really go into talking about your significant other. It seems to me like we might have kind of a little discrepancy of avoiding talking about your significant other here. So, is this an example of that kind of like avoiding actually talking about and dealing with this? Do you think this might be a time that we could go into this kind of avoidance? Of talking about the conflict and working on the conflicts that you're having with this significant other. So these are ways that you actually see the conflict in action, you see the discrepancy in action, and you point it out and you invite them to go deeper into it. So you don't want to do it early in the relationship, and you don't want to do it just because someone has a discrepancy. So if they're like talking, their issue is their significant other, their issue they're talking to you is weight loss, their issue they're talking to you about is academic performance, and then all of a sudden they talk about how they got drunk and drove home on the other night, and you're what, like, oh, that's a problem, I want to talk about it, but that has nothing to do with what they're actually been working on. You don't need to go in and talk about that. All of us have areas of growth, discrepancy in our lives. We don't need people that we're working with to just point them out because it's something that they're curious or that they think we need to work on. Now, if you're concerned about it, there's a different time in which you can point it out as an issue of concern, but it's not something that you insist that someone works on. If a client responds to the confrontation with denial or disinterest, you can state that, but you're not, with an empathetic confrontation, you're not insisting that they have to then, like, pushing them to change. All right, so um, this slide, oops, sorry. Um, reflection of meaning. This is in this slide, we're going to, oh, sorry. Oh, okay, I got to resume. Thank you. So this is a time when we're talking about reflection of meaning where you're going to have, I'm now switching to, sorry, I got a little distracted there in my mind because that was one of my abrupt transitions. I apologize for that. So this is chapter 11, reflection of meaning and interpretation or reframing. So we're going to talk about kind of two skills here. In my experience, a lot of students who take social work classes are very good at identifying themes in people's stories. And these are the skills that you want to do, you're using when you find theme identification. So the first one is exactly what it sounds like. You're inviting a reflection of meaning and often for them to reflect on potential meaning in their story. The second thing with interpretation and reframing is when you do theme identification. So in this case, in reflection of meaning, you are directing the interviewee toward finding like kind of the deeper underlying significance or values that are involved in the different aspects of their story. It's not your opinion. Instead, it's a reflection. So you're inviting or offering things to them. And what this does for many people is it anchors different aspects of their stories, like mini, like they might have this piece of the story, they might tell you this thing happened, this thing happened, this thing happened, but they might not be able to anchor it. For some of you, you've already been doing this in form of interpretation. You've already been doing it when you offer summaries. You're like kind of bringing themes together and anchoring, but this is inviting them to do it. So you can do it by reflecting it and offering to see, like, do they do it? Or you can, or do they agree with you? So you're hearing someone tell this story about they woke up this morning and this happened. They're so stressed in their life. And then this and this and this happened. And then, oh, yeah, they remember a time this happened before and a time this happened before. And then you hear all the stories and you're like, wow, it sounds like they really, really care about the people in their life and trying to do a good job at school and trying to do a good job at work, but sounds like they're really struggling with boundaries and taking care of themselves. Like you hear that, they don't say that. And right, so that's kind of like an underlying thing that's going on. Or you just hear that like maybe people are a priority over things in their life, right? Maybe you hear a strength in their story. And so paraphrasing it back and putting that strength in their story, putting a value that you hear from their stories into it would be a reflection, a way that you would reflect meaning, similar to the way you use a paraphrase or a reflection of feeling. You can also use a question, and there's a bunch of questions on page 260 and 262 that are like good examples of ways that you could use questions to ask them to get at the meaning or values in their stories. This can really help bring out kind of the sources of confusion in their discrepancies. It can bring out aspects of existential concerns because sometimes there aren't answers to the concerns that people bring to us. So anchoring things in values and in motivation or meaning can help people anchor themselves in the midst of situations where there aren't answers, and it can bring deeper meaning to these kind of discrepancies that people have. It can bring kind of insights or aha moments that can help clear the way for deeper levels of motivation. It's also, I think one of the students in this class is asked about like, well, where in the 5-stage interview process might you use a skill? So this is a really good one when you're moving to goal setting or the latter part. So you already have built some relationship, you know their strengths or you know their story, and you're trying to move towards goal setting. So this is a great thing to use for strength identification after you've heard a lot of part of their story and you're trying to figure out like how do we set goals, what's meaningful to them, and how do we move towards restory and action, because it's connected again to motivation. So again, you don't want to use this early in the relationship. You want to stick to paraphrases, which are really based on content, and you want to use reflection of feeling when that's appropriate for the person and for the content. So another piece of this same skill from chapter 11 is the interpretation and reframing. Now, I just want to say that if you read chapter 11, I'm mixing some of my understanding of these skills with the book. So if you read the book, you're going to get a little bit of a different twinge or a little bit of a difference in this. So hopefully the way I do this will be helpful to you. That's why I'm distinguishing these things to make them helpful. In the way I'm explaining this, interpretation is something that the interviewer offers the interviewee. In my experience, students who take this class are very good at theme identification. They see and can hear somebody talk, they hear a few stories, and they see the links between those stories. And they're like, oh, I can hear this value amongst your stories. I can hear this consistent behavior or this consistent way of thinking or this consistent opinion that you have. Whatever it is, it's like a theme identification. It's a theme that comes throughout the stories. And so I think because students recognize that, they're like, well, what do I do with it? I don't even realize I'm doing it. It's one of the things that it's one of the dispositions that people who often go into social work have. They kind of see some implicit stuff in people's stories. And so the way that I want everyone to know that that is an influencing. If you use that, it's like reading someone's mail. They don't know that there's values, opinions, a deeper meaning linking parts of their stories because they're just talking. They may know it, but often they don't. So if you see those links, please know that they may not see it and they may feel like, oh my God, what are you talking about? I was just telling you a story about my family and about going to work and about rushing to lunch. And now you're talking about I need to work on boundaries or you're talking about some strength I have and prioritizing the stuff that's important to me. That's not what I was telling you about, right? So you want to be careful with that skill because people don't know that strength you have, I should say, they don't know that what you're doing. They're just telling you facts and you're taking it to this like explicit underlying thing that's connecting things they're telling you. So you want to be careful if that's one of your like just innate abilities is to connect stories by the underlying themes that are running underneath them. The other thing is just because you see it doesn't mean that it's correct. And hopefully you learned that somewhere in an English class that when you read something and you find a theme or a thesis in it, you will use evidence to support that theme or thesis, but someone else could use different evidence to support a different theme or thesis. And you want to keep that in mind because just like offering a paraphrase, I would suggest that we offer themes, we offer reflection of meaning, we offer interpretation. It's someone else's story. And although we may feel really strongly that our interpretation is right, that our theme identification is correct, it one may be correct, two, it may be wrong, or three, it may be correct, but at the wrong time. The person may not be vibing with it at the moment, or they may not vibe with it at all, ever. So it's just important to know that just because you see the underlying thing or you feel like you see the underlying thing, it doesn't mean that that other person sees it, feels it, or is ready for it. So just that's I understand I'm saying a lot of stuff, but I just this is often an innate ability of people who take this class and are good with these interpersonal skills. So okay, I'll stop belaboring that point. So interpretation is when the interviewer offers this underlying theme or meaning to the interviewee. Reframing is when the interviewer offers a different perspective. So I hear that you've been talking about how difficult your this whole day has been and that this is the same kind of day you have all the time and everything is so stressful. I'd like to offer you a different perspective. It sounds to me like one of your strengths is navigating a very busy schedule. If you offer that, you want to pause and see how they respond to it. So there's the interpretation and there is the reframing. So again, the purpose is to offer these deeper understandings of the story, the issue, or the problem. And you're also accessing the deeper strengths and underlying resiliency to produce change. It's the like deeper streams or depths of things that people are actually accessing in their everyday lives. So the way that you do this is that you listen for the themes or the deeper meanings in the story, which, as I pointed out at nauseum, is that many of you probably are doing anyways. And then it goes over easier if you understand why you came to that theme. So you might say something like, I've been hearing you talk for a while, and back when you told this story, you said this, and when you told this story, you said this, and when you told this story, you said this. So based on all those things, It sounds like you have a really high value of this. Did I get that one right? So again, you're offering the interpretation and you're explaining how you got there, as opposed to be like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I've heard you say a couple things, like people are a high priority to you. Like, okay, yeah, who's going to say no, I hate people? Well, maybe some people will, but you know what I mean? So that's the interpretation. And again, it involves linking, right? Connecting two more parts of the client story or what clients have said. So, and then how to use reframing. I gave an example of that. Here, maybe this is another way that you could look at it. What do you think about this other perspective or alternative? Um, so if the interviewee is really confused, they want to give it the deeper meaning, but they're confused, probably adding this is going to cause more confusion. You can try because sometimes it'll clear it up. It'll be like, oh yeah, that's the underlying thing that, and I'm staying on the surface and that's causing the cloud. If you offer it and it just makes it more confusing, you can be like, okay, well, maybe I'm just making it more complicated. Let's go back out and talk about, the details or however you want to do it. Please avoid it if you don't have rapport because the person's not going to necessarily trust your interpretation. And don't say like that. Don't don't offer. Let's see. Avoid it as subtractive empathy. Like, yeah, I hear that this happened, this happened, this happened, and well, at least you're really resilient. I'm not saying you would say it that way, but sometimes people can get a little. I don't know if this is the right word, but like as opposed to really engaging authentically with people, it can be easy to listen to people's stories and hear the same consistent themes coming out when people are in pain. And people can get a little like flippant about the way that's affecting the individual in front of them. So you want to avoid that because you will hear some of the same themes coming up again and again as you listen to people, even if you're just doing something like intakes. But once you get in the field, you'll be like in a niche, and that niche is you'll begin to hear the same things again and again. All right. So, what about all these other things that are in chapter 12? Chapter 12 has building resilience and managing stress, self disclosure, feedback, logical consequences, directives, instruction, and psychoeducation. So, this is all very directive interventions that are focused specifically on change. And in this case, you're listening, you're assessing and intervening, and you're checking to see if it vibes with the client. There's a bunch of them you can use. These are not the only ones. These are the ones that they chose to put in this book, but every theory has different ones. And new ones are developing all the time as theories ebb and flow and try to respond to the efficacy, the complexity of mental illness, and the changes that are happening as people change in response to environmental changes and as mental health ebbs and flows in response to environmental stressors, like large environmental stressors, like post pandemic, like political climate. These are things that we see. Um, if that affect actually what kind of interventions are being used out there. So these are just a few, but I think that this is a good baseline for teaching kind of like what kind of influencing skills are out there. So one of them is empathetic self-disclosure. So this is when the interviewer shares their own experiences. And if I could just pause here and say, it's vitally important that you understand the difference between personal and professional helping. And so just shooting the shit like you might with a friend, they tell a story, you say, yeah, I understand. This is what happened to me too. This is not professional helping. That's personal helping. So self disclosure on the part of a helper needs to be intentional, needs to have some purpose behind it. That means intentional, right? I'm just repeating again that it needs to be intentional. There's three times now. But also, the helper needs to have some kind of healing attached to what they share. Because if not, what happens really quick? The helper becomes helped by the helpee, and the roles flip super fast in the interaction. And then all of a sudden, we're in mutual helping, which is more like really good personal community based helping, which is beautiful and essential and great part of the human experience. but it's not professional helping. And so we could have long philosophical arguments about the weird model that we have for professional helping where the helper does all the helping, but those are our ethical boundaries that we have currently in the field. So we could talk about changing the model and a lot of things, but that's what we do now professionally. And so the empathetic self-disclosure is something that you want to think about, get consultation and supervision about, and you don't just want to be sharing your story just to share your story, and you definitely don't want to share your story so that other with the idea of producing mini yous. And what I mean by that is mini, M-I-N-I, yous, Y-O-U, I guess there's an S at the end of that, many versions of yourself. You're not trying to say, well, this worked for me, so this will work for you. This is not the purpose of self disclosure. So when you think of self disclosure, you want to be really doing some more reading about it and thinking about it, paying attention to how it's used in your workplace and whether it's used ethically in your workplace, because it's not used ethically everywhere. And it's not even used in a way that's always helpful to clients. It can be really helpful to the helper because they need to continue to work on getting healing. We all do, right? And getting helped. But the source of getting helped is not from your clients, right? The source of engaging in a heal in like a real human interaction where we're all human, that's a vital part of the helping relationship. That's the authentic part that Rogers is talking about. Like we need to be human as helpers in our relationships with those that we interview, that we interact with. But that doesn't mean that being human and being authentic is not the same as shooting the shit with somebody and revealing all the parts that we still need to work on, and get help with. It doesn't mean that we have to be perfect. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a lot of nuance around self disclosure. So I would avoid doing it until you've gotten some consultation and supervision around it. So, what about empathetic feedback? This is where the interviewer shares their thoughts, feelings, and whatever about what the interviewee says. Now, this doesn't occur until you have rapport. And if you think about this, I use this a lot in class. I get that I'm not the interviewer and you're not the interviewees. But once I know you, a lot of you, I actually use this most frequently when you all are not giving yourself credit for your strengths. And so basically, I kind of reserve the right to call bullshit on you when you're like being like, well, here's what I need to work on, but not giving yourself credit for your strengths. I used to use this a lot with teenagers because they would basically tell me how terrible they were, how like bad they had done in something, or even how terrible somebody was, usually an adult. And I would listen empathetically and I would tell them what their perspective was. And I'd be like, but I watched you with that person and I saw them do this. So what you're saying doesn't make any sense to me. So it's like my way to call bullshit on someone and be like, I care about you and I get that that's your perspective and that's what you're telling me that you remember from that. And that's not, you and I both know that that's not the whole story, right? Or I need to push you to go deeper to nuance that. Or you're avoiding part of the story, even the good part of the story, because you're focusing on the bad part. You're focusing on your part that's not good. So this can be very powerful if you have rapport, because what it does is it challenges people. For me, I usually challenge it for people to look at something they're denying. And often the thing that they're denying are the really positive growth or strengths that they have. So empathetic feedback can be great, especially around growth that people have made. All right, so logical consequences. This one can be a really good way to do restory. So if you do this, what will happen? If you don't do this, what will happen? We do this a lot, like punishment. So we got to be careful with this that we're not going back into that like way that people taught us. If you do this, what do you think is going to happen? But it can be a very good like cognitive rehearsal around restory. Okay, instruction and psychoeducation. I want to point out the fact that we do this a lot in social work, human services, a lot in groups where we're teaching people stuff about psychological concepts. We're teaching about self care. We're teaching basic. I don't. We teach all kinds of basic like wellness, emotional regulation, almost all group counseling. That's like a lot of groups are like this now, like psychoeducational groups. And I'll say two things. One, we're not using good educational teaching principles a lot of times in the field. This has been every state I've been in. So Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Maryland, Chicago, Illinois, and here. This is what I've seen in education, in psychoeducation groups, is that we're not using a lot of good teaching principles to underlie the creation and delivery of psychoeducational interventions, both therapeutically one on one and in the group setting. So that's kind of distressing. And two, this is what people often do without master's degrees, which is you're not required to have a master's degrees to teach people stuff about psychological principles and wellness. But that also means that you'll be doing it both individually and large and often in group settings and often in little pieces, even if you're just teaching people about like how to access services, right? How to like get a referral, like what a psychologist is versus what a psychiatrist is versus what a social worker is. This is like basic knowledge, but you have to like teach people this or like help them understand the information. So it's worthwhile thinking about how this is like a skill of how do you explain something to someone and how do you assess whether or not they've actually understood it. All right, so directives. This is using your influence to direct clients on things that they should do. And your book uses this largely as a way to direct people toward wellness. And if you're directing people toward wellness, not your opinion, but what we know in the psychological literature is actually true around wellness, you're definitely staying within your scope of practice and you're not moving into being a therapist when when you have an associate's degree or a certificate. So if your directives have to do with wellness and prevention, you're likely going to be not stepping over boundaries. These are just a few examples of ways that we facilitate change. All right, so let's finish up chapter 13, counseling theories, how to integrate the micro skills in multiple approaches, and chapter 14, determining your own personal style. So there's some good information about integration on page 349 and through 51 and 362 through 63 that I encourage you to look at. Appendix 1 has all of the skills. And then there's also this idea of how do the skills get into different types of interviewing and different theoretical approaches to interviewing, which you're going to look at that stuff when you look at some videos, well, a video coming up. So here's what happens for you to integrate is that you have to know about the skills, which is why I gave you that extra like extended test over the skills. And then you have to be able to use the skills. And hopefully you can use them intentionally. You develop your own personal style where you bring in your personality and your culture, including your cultural communication style. You understand your theoretical approach to helping. We'll be talking more about that. I have another video that I'm prepping for you. I might record it right now, actually. So, your theoretical approach to helping. And then the type of interview that you're doing is really a vital part of how you integrate. So, you're only going to use some skills for some types of interviews. So if you're doing an intake or if you're doing like a follow-up to an intake or you're doing like brief case management, so you're just checking in, if you're doing individual counseling or group counseling, not therapy necessarily, but maybe you're doing like drug and alcohol counseling or something like that, any of these things, you're going to be using the skills differently depending on what the intention of the overall interview is. And then so integration depends on that stuff. So it's a lot of things, right? What you know, what your skills are, who you are, what approach you're using to helping, and what you're doing, like what type of interview you're doing. So what your job is and what your role is, what the outcome is expected at that moment. Addition to that, so how do you do this? How do you get to the point where you can do all of that stuff? You're gonna have to practice, which is one of the reasons why I have all those application assignments that I'm hoping that you are practicing the skill. The other thing is that you can apply the micro skills to your interpersonal communication all over your life. Practice paraphrasing, practice reflection of feeling, practice summarizing what people are saying to you, practice actively listening, practice asking intentional questions that aren't like grilling people, but that you're asking really good open ended questions. Look at that chapter in the book again, because we didn't cover questions in depth, and bring comments or questions about questions to class. And keep assessing your strengths and your areas for continued growth in the use of micro skills and in the use of them all together in your interpersonal communication. This effective communication, especially the basic listening sequence, is not unique to interviewing. Interviewing professionally is a great way to understand your role and to practice the skills and use the skills well. But it also can help you in your interpersonal communication just broadly, right? So I would encourage you to integrate these skills into your life and into your development as a social work human service professional. And if you don't even go into the field of social work human services, all of the employers pretty much are telling us that they're going to be continually looking for soft skills, even in the evolution of AI. The AI can't do soft skills, at least at the current moment. This is what we're hearing, is that the development of soft skills, the use of soft skills, the interpersonal communication, both at the individual and group level, is going to continue to be a vital skill that humans uniquely are bringing to their interactions. And that is hopefully what you have got and will continue to be getting out of this class as we wind down the rest of the semester. So in today's lecture, we finished the book. We covered information in chapter 9. I'm going to flip back real quick. I know it's a little dizzying. We finished the information in chapter 9 on focusing, 10 on empathetic confrontation, 11 on reflection of meaning and interpretation and reframing. We talked about, I mixed together empathetic self-disclosure and feedback. Oh, no, I did those separately. I think I mixed those with directives, psychoeducation, and the other ones. I didn't cover every single one of those. I pulled the things out that I thought were important. And lastly, that very last slide was about skill integration. And in relation to skill integration, it helps all of this, building on all of this, you get to that penultimate point of understanding your personal style, both professionally, whether it's in social work in human services or whether it's in a different career field. You'll have a personal communication style that can integrate and use everything on this pyramid. And also personally, in your interpersonal relationships, these skills can make up a more purposeful, intentional communication style, so that all of us, as Rogers would hope that we would, I believe he would have hoped, because he did a lot of work, not just therapeutically and not just as an educator, but in the latter part of his career, he worked on things globally around world peace. And so I think what Rogers would say, and granted, I don't have a quote from him, but I think what he would say is that as we all grow into more authentic versions of ourselves who can empathetically understand one another and understand each other's human experience, that we can contribute more to a meaningful life ourselves and to meaningfully connect with others. And I believe that these skills are not the panacea that will fix all of our problems, but they're like a vital piece of the puzzle. And so hopefully as we've finished this book and this knowledge, you will continue to develop these skills and to grow into your personal style. Thank you very much.